And through our fundraising communications, through our one-on-one interactions with donors, we're really looking to use those opportunities to educate and to inform. And a lot of folks support Ecojustice because they see us as thought leaders in this space. And in a way, we have a certain level of power in those donor interactions, right? They're looking to us to share some insights where we can do that in a way that's not finger pointing, right? It's not saying, hey, white supremacists, it's your fault that we're in this mess, but it's, hey, let's figure this out together, right? Because you can be the solution too, right? My team knows, and our staff at Ecojustice know that if a donor is really offensive, that they don't have to accept that gift, right? They can use that opportunity if they feel safe, if they feel that it's something that they can do in that moment to respectfully share their perspectives and their knowledge of a specific issue, right? Really focusing on the environmental issues or on the social justice issue, and use that opportunity to try to inform and try to educate that donor. And, through the conversation that we had, their perspective really shifted and the donor ended up doubling their donation at the end of that conversation. So there are some really good wins. We're definitely seeing more wins.
Welcome back to The Small Nonprofit, the podcast where your passion meets action. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. Today, I'm here with Huda, who has a hilarious joke about her name already.
Thank you so much, Maria. And hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today too. Yeah, my name is Huda Al-Saidi. Huda, pronounced like Hood, as in Robin Hood. My funny joke is that I take from the rich and I give to the needy charities and organizations to do great things because I'm a professional fundraiser and I've been doing this work for about 20 years. But just to back up to tell you a little bit more about who I am, I use she, her pronouns. I am based in Vancouver. I'm a settler, a first generation settler on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I'm currently the director of Philanthropy at Ecojustice, which is an environmental law charity which uses the power of the law to defend nature, combat climate change, and fight for a healthy environment for everyone on these lands.
I'm so happy that you're here. Oh, I'm so excited to hear about everything that you've been working on. And I've already heard so many good things about you. So this is super great. I'm just wondering, can you tell me a little bit about how you got into philanthropy originally and why did you choose to become a fundraiser?
Oh, I love that question because everybody in fundraising has a really interesting story about how we ended up in this space. It wasn't like someone asked me when I was 5 years old, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a fundraiser. No, didn't quite go like that. I actually thought I was going to be a lawyer and was very interested and passionate in fighting for human rights and had a special interest in humanitarian law. So I actually got as far as getting a degree in law. But once I graduated, I actually quickly decided that I didn't want to practice law. It wasn't quite right for me. But what I did realize fairly early on in my career was that I could still have a really strong impact in people's lives, and particularly defending people's rights and advancing justice for people by working for nonprofits. And I have some natural talent and skill, I think, in sales and marketing and fundraising. So, it was an easy fit for me to land my first job working for a children's charity based in the UK. Started off in a community fundraising role. My very first role, coming up on 20 years ago now, it was a community fundraising position, but it was specifically designed in a brand new role to engage ethnic minorities and diverse communities in the work that the organization was doing, because we recognized that we were supporting a very large number of children from Black and Asian backgrounds, South Asian backgrounds mostly. But the funding that we received, the demographics of the donors looked quite different to that. And so we were missing this opportunity to build a community that would benefit and would really help to see like the impact of their donations on their own community. So that, I think, was really pioneering and trailblazing back then. We've seen that more and more across the nonprofit sector in recent years. And then I moved from that role to managing a major campaign for that charity for a program for children who were experiencing abuse. Engaged a lot of corporate organizations in that work. And around then, that was in parallel, I was actually doing a master's degree in global ethics. And so I wanted to get some more international experience. So that took me to work for the UN Refugee Agency. I was doing a lot of work with refugees, particularly those who had been displaced by wars, and often wars that were fought because other countries wanted access to their oil and gas and natural resources. And then from there, it's a bit of a love story. I won't tell you that part today, but I met a lovely Canadian guy, which is how I then ended up moving over to Canada, still with the lovely Canadian guy, and got a job working for the Canadian Cancer Society and did that for a few years and then moved over to Ecojustice. And, I think the common thread that binds all the work that I do is that fundamental to addressing like child poverty and fundamental to addressing refugee crises and fundamental to addressing human health issues is the protection of the environment. And that is so intertwined in social justice. And yeah, I'm really pleased with sort of the direction that my career's gone and that I've had the privilege of being able to apply my skills to do this great work and connect donors with the organizations that I care so much about.
And how long have you been at Ecojustice?
It's been a little over 9 years now. Time flies when you're having fun.
Wow, that's a long time for a fundraiser.
I'm really pleased to share with you that we have a really fabulous team at Ecojustice, about 17 people now in the fundraising department, and half of us have been on the team for 5 years or more. It really is a fantastic place to work. And I think it's partly because we have this incredibly inclusive and dynamic and collaborative culture. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about today.
Yeah, wow, that's fantastic. Seriously, congrats, Ecojustice, for keeping your fundraisers for more than 5 years. Wow, that's amazing. I wanted to ask a little bit about Ecojustice itself. I've never worked at an environmental nonprofit, so I don't exactly know how not white supremacy they are, or if they are. But I
Mhm.
hear that sometimes it can be a challenging area of practice because so much of that racial justice element is taken out of it. Have you found that in other organizations across the sector? Do you think that's what sets Ecojustice apart? Tell me a little bit about that.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe just to provide a little context to my answer, Ecojustice is an organization that defends all kinds of organizations and individuals in cases that we bring forwards that are often holding government or corporations to account their actions that have harmed the environment. And often we find ourselves representing Indigenous groups, First Nations, individual Canadians, and other environmental organizations, and more recently, some other social justice organizations. And we also work with partner organizations to push for stronger legislation through sort of government relations and law reform strategies. Um, I think by virtue of the work that we do, where we're partnering with such diverse groups, we have done a really good job of building our understanding and building relations with Indigenous and other marginalized communities and groups. Could we do better? Yes, absolutely. Is that something that we're committed to and something that we're currently investing in and building programs for? Yes, that is the priority for us and really a real big focus of our work at the moment. Like many environmental organizations, we do have a history of a more colonial impact and a colonial structure to our work. I think when we look back at the environmental sector overall, we have a history of protecting the environment in the sense of it being conservation of spaces, right? The protection of these wild spaces that we imagine that we keep pristine by keeping humans out of them. And of course, Indigenous peoples have lived and stewarded these lands since time immemorial. So, this idea of creating and conserving spaces where humans are not there is actually it's upholding that colonial mantra and that colonial philosophy and approach to environmental protection and land protection. And so, we're really shifting in our understanding of what it means and how we best protect the environment and centering Indigenous voices, advancing Indigenous reconciliation and Indigenous sovereignty in our work. We now appreciate much better as being like fundamental to achieving the lasting solutions that we want to see in the world.
I know you talked a little bit earlier about integrating like the organizational values into their fundraising. So, serving communities and not having that represented in the donor base. Is that similar to Ecojustice? How do you work with that issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. To be honest, I think like many organizations, we don't have really strong demographic data on our donors. So I can't tell you X percentage of our donors are from this community and X percentages from that community. But what we do see is that when we organize events and bring donors together, right, typically the average age of the donor in the room is about 60, right, 60 plus. And they are typically white donors that come from a certain higher economic social background. And so we are looking at, how we can do this differently, right? And how we can be more inclusive. But what we recognize first and foremost, what we have to do before we start like targeting diverse donors and targeting those different audiences is really make sure that we're leading with the work, right? And that the work that we're doing is truly inclusive and is truly equitable so that when we bring those folks into our work that they're going to have a really amazing experience, that they're going to see themselves represented and connected and advocated for in the work that we do.
I think that's a place where most organizations will fall short. Like they'll say,
Agreed.
why can't we recruit diverse board members? And they haven't done that internal work to make their spaces attractive to people who are not homogenous. What has that looked like for you?
Yeah, so we've done so much work on so many different layers, and we recognize we still have so much work to do, right? It's like when you start this journey towards inclusive and Indigenized workspaces, inclusive Indigenized philanthropy, I think what you start to realize is there's a bit where you know what you know, and then there's the bit that you know that you don't know, and you're trying to learn and fill in that gap. But as you move into that space of learning what you don't know, you realize there's even more that you don't know, right? So it's this continuous learning journey. And I think recognizing that has actually been really fundamental to the progress that we've made. Actually had a really impactful conversation with a DEI, a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant one time who said, we're never going to achieve 100% inclusion or diversity like in our lifetimes. We have to appreciate that the work that we're doing is building those foundational blocks, right? And creating that framework to pass on to the next generation to continue this work. And we will get there, but it's a very long journey that we have ahead of us. And what that's looked like at Ecojustice is starting from an organizational level, right? Looking at our organizational policies, our employment policies, our recruitment policies. Are they really inclusive? Are they really equitable? From things like thinking about how we're describing the roles and what are the criteria, the job criteria, the requirements for the job that we're looking for. How can we be more equitable to folks who maybe haven't had the privilege to build certain skills or go to university, right? To be able to apply for these jobs. And starting in that higher level of like how we bring in the right people and diverse people into the organization and being more equitable in that. Through to looking at our hiring practices. So, we always ask folks now if they need accommodations and recognizing that people with neurodiversities like to fidget, right? And welcome like having a fidget toy to play with while you're in an interview, right? I'm a real doodler, right? People see me doodling on the side of my page, and that's actually my way of concentrating on things. It's kind of the big picture of how we bring the right people into the organization because we recognize that we need those diverse voices to help us build a more inclusive and equitable workspace. And so once they're in, okay, how do we make sure that we are holding space for folks to be able to bring their full selves to work in a way that allows them to represent and bring forward those ideas and help us have more voices and different perspectives to help us address the problems and the challenges that we've really been struggling with in a way that is also not causing harm to others, right? We've had to do quite a bit of work on what does it mean to have a call-in culture versus a call-out culture, recognizing that sometimes calling out can do more harm than good. So building that internal culture has been fundamental to this work too. And then looking specifically at philanthropy and at fundraising, right? And how can we do that better? I think this journey for philanthropy really started with us reading Edgar Villanueva's book, Colonizing Wealth, which most folks on the team read about 2.5, 3 years ago now. And that kind of triggered some work that we were doing that for a while we were calling decolonizing philanthropy. Through that journey, what we started to do was hold monthly sessions within the philanthropy team where folks could volunteer to lead a session and facilitate a 1 hour or a 90-minute session where they would bring a topic that was related to justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, or reconciliation, something they learned about and how they thought it might impact philanthropy to the group, to the team. And so recognizing that like none of us are experts in this, but we can all learn together was really powerful. And so folks would like maybe have read a blog post or read an article or heard about an organization like Justice Funders, for example, who are doing really fantastic work in this space of reforming the grant making system in the US, to bring forward like some things that we'd learned from there, share those with the team, hold space for conversation, and then really hold space for thinking about, okay, how can we apply this to our work? What does this mean for like how we do things differently? And I think one example of something we talked about was the concept of land back, right? And land repatriation to Indigenous peoples. And what does that look like? And it was pretty relevant to us because occasionally we do receive gifts of land from donors. And so within our policy, prior to this work we've been doing, we would accept those gifts of land with some terms and conditions. But recognizing that these lands were often stolen, right, from Indigenous peoples, that if we're really committed to Indigenous reconciliation, what we have to do is first encourage the donor to offer those lands back to the Indigenous peoples who come from that community. And so what we then did was changed our policy, right? So that is now a requirement that our fundraisers, if a donor approaches them with a potential gift of land, our fundraisers are required to have that conversation with the donor and recommend that the donor take steps to try to return the land to the Indigenous communities. You know, if that doesn't work out, then they can try to give the land to Ecojustice, but Ecojustice will then try to reach out to the Indigenous communities to try to return the land prior to accepting it ourselves. It's little things like that and how doing this work together, we've identified some pretty significant changes in how we fundraise, and also recognizing that the way that we talk about our work needs to shift. That I think, like many organizations, we've unintentionally upheld this concept of a hero and a victim through our fundraising communications in the past. And of course, it is Indigenous peoples who hold the knowledge, right? And often the communities on the front lines of environmental justice, not just Indigenous communities, potentially impoverished communities and folks with other marginalized backgrounds who are often disproportionately impacted by pollution, that really know what's going on their lands. And those guys are the heroes, right? So we've really started to shift how we talk about our work to uplift them as the heroes and feature donors as partners, right, that can fund and enable the great work that these heroes are doing. And Ecojustice really is just like this facilitating organization that's connecting the dots. Yeah, so that's just a little taster of our journey to what we now call inclusive and indigenized philanthropy. I mentioned how it started by naming it this journey, decolonizing philanthropy. And on this journey, what we realized was decolonizing potentially is not the right term, right? It's because the concept of decolonizing may mean to some folks, right, the entire removal of colonizers from this philanthropic system. That's probably very unlikely to happen, right? But what we can do is indigenize it by bringing in more Indigenous voices, by bringing more Indigenous wisdom into our work. And that's why organizations like the Circle on Philanthropy, that is an Indigenous-led and Indigenous-run organization, has really also been trailblazing in this work and been a great resource for us in terms of the messaging and the information and just the great tips and advice and wisdom that they've been able to share, that's really helping to shift the philanthropic sector, which we know was built on a colonial system originally and still typically like built by the rich for the rich, that through the taxation system and the tax benefits and the social status benefits that donors have typically gained from the traditional philanthropic system, it's just further perpetuated that colonial structure and further benefited the dominant culture and dominant society.
All those things sound Really amazing. I don't know if there's many organizations who are at that level of kind of like inclusivity and really thinking things through, like even the wording and the gift acceptance, all that stuff. Did you face any challenges internally? Was your board fully, woohoo, I want to be inclusive? Or was it first about getting the right people at the table? What were the challenges?
Yeah, we have a fantastic board and our leadership team. I think from pretty early on, everybody was very committed to, we call it JEDI and reconciliation, eco-justice, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and reconciliation. I think where the challenge was like, okay, we're committed to it. We know it's the right thing to do, but what does that actually mean? Right? And how do we do it? And so that's where the rubber hit the road and things definitely started to get more thorny for us. We've really learned so much from some incredible Indigenous professionals and experts in this space. Honey Creative have come in and done some cultural safety, cultural awareness training with all of our staff. They also did a session with our board specifically to help build that cultural awareness at the board level. We've also been working with Gwen Bridge more recently, who's kind of sharing this incredible model of ethical space, right? Which is like, how do we build this sort of pluralistic structure of working together with Indigenous groups that recognizes that we have very different worldviews, right? Coming from a colonial perspective versus coming from an Indigenous perspective. And how do we find this ethical space in the middle where we can come together to build that bridge and work together to address the fundamental problems that are impacting the environment and society at large? So, yeah, I think those are some of the steps we've taken that have really helped us address some of those early challenges of how do we do this work? And I think, yeah, like I said, we still got a long way to go. Definitely wanting to bring more diverse and Indigenous voices into our work. So, we're going to be hiring for a new role, a director of Indigenous partnerships. I'll be posting for fairly soon. So that's going to be quite exciting for us to build on the good work that we have been doing to really deepen those relationships with the communities that we want to serve and with the communities that we know have got incredible wisdom that we want to partner with.
I love the example with seeing if you are actually going to accept a gift of land. Are there other examples like that that you like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I think another interesting thing that we have been working on is what we call supportive philanthropy at Ecojustice. Again, recognizing that as an organization that has benefited from a colonial philanthropic structure and an organization that has a fairly high level of privilege and power within the charitable space because we do have charitable status. We have strong funding from organizations and from individual donors. And we have access to funders and we have, as I mentioned, a 17-person fundraising team, incredible resources that allow us to fundraise and acquire more funds. We're acquiring these funds in and from an economy that was built on capitalism and it was built on extractive industries. And we're really thinking, and we have been thinking and doing a lot of work to figure out how can we use our power and privilege to better serve the organizations and communities that don't have access to those resources because there is inequitable distribution of resources in across Turtle Island. And recognizing that, what we now do is where there are organizations, typically Indigenous organizations, but maybe other organizations that have barriers to accessing funds, we can work with them. If they're organizations that are aligned with Ecojustice's mission and that we are likely partnering with or would like to partner with, we'll work with them to potentially help them with grant writing, help them with consultancy, like an advice on their fundraising programs, review their website, review their emails for them and give them some tips. And I think there have also been a couple of instances where we've acted essentially as a fiscal agent. So we've applied for funding and received it and then regranted it to organizations that align with Ecojustice's mandates and are working on the same mission. So that's been one other example of how we've done that. What's the word? Like inner reflection, right? That nasal gazing, right? Yeah. To figure out kind of how are we showing up and how can we better use our power and privilege to create a more equitable philanthropic sector?
I'd love to hear about how that shows up in your relationship with your donors. So I wonder, like, how many of your team members are racialized versus like your donors? And then is there education that you're putting out there to make sure that they're safe when they get into those one-to-one interactions and your like gift rejection policy, like all that stuff? I'd love to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah. We have an incredibly diverse team, not just racial diversity, but diverse in terms of age, gender, sexual orientation, diverse abilities. So, really incredible group. And I think that has also really helped us think about how would we want to be spoken to, right? How would we want an organization like Ecojustice to reach out to us and engage us in our work? And how can we advocate for the communities and the backgrounds that we come from? Folks who can't see me, maybe I'll just share a little bit about my identity too. I am of both European and Iraqi descent. And I think I'm an example of somebody who's wearing two hats and see things from different perspectives. Having a team of folks with diverse perspectives has really helped us reshape how we're engaging donors and how we're reaching out to them. And I think it's a journey that we're on in terms of the donors that we currently engage. We recognize we need to bring those donors along on this journey with us. We have historically, as many fundraising organizations have done, leaned into what has worked really well. Fundraisers typically what's going to raise the most money, what's going to have the greatest return on investment. And so we've leaned into kind of fundraising copy and fundraising communications and image selection that has raised the most money from that specific demographic of donors because we historically built a fairly white, fairly elderly donor base. And so recognizing now, okay, we want to engage a more diverse audience, but we don't want to alienate very loyal donors who are incredibly important to us and who support ecojustice because they share our vision for a healthy and thriving environment. And many of Ecojustice's donors do appreciate the intersectionality between environmental justice and social justice. But for some folks, this idea of addressing systemic injustices isn't the obvious solution to saving the planet, right? Or saving the environment. And through our fundraising communications, through our one-on-one interactions with donors, we're really looking to use those opportunities to educate and to inform. And a lot of folks support eco-justice because they see us as thought leaders in this space. And in a way, we have a certain level of power in those donor interactions, right? They're looking to us to share some insights where we can do that in a way that's not finger pointing, right? It's not saying, hey, white supremacists, it's your fault that we're in this mess, right? But it's no, hey, let's figure this out together, right? Because you can be the solution too, right? You can help work this out, but this is how it needs to look different in order for us to do that. I think for our fundraisers, that often shows up in interactions and conversations that are having with donors where things that donors say or do may actually be microaggressions or even just flat out aggressions in some of the things that folks say intentionally or unintentionally. Throughout our journey to inclusive and Indigenized philanthropy, we've done a lot of work within the team of like, what does it look like to identify a microaggression? How do we respond when we hear them? How do we manage ourselves? My team knows, and our staff at Ecojustice know that if a donor is really offensive, that they don't have to accept that gift, right? That they can use that opportunity if they feel safe, if they feel that it's something that they can do in that moment to respectfully share their perspectives and their knowledge of a specific issue, right? Really focusing on the environmental issues or on the social justice issue, and use that opportunity to try to inform and try to educate that donor. But ultimately, if a donor decides that, okay, no, I'm not into that, right? That's not why I support eco-justice, then my team feel empowered to be able to walk away from that relationship in a respectful way and say, okay, this is the direction that eco-justice is headed in. This is what we recognize is fundamental to protecting the environment. And they're difficult conversations, but we've gone from a place where fundraisers, and particularly those with marginalized identities, have dreaded microaggression conversations with donors to a place where typically when our fundraisers have these conversations, they actually go really well. And the donor turns around and says, huh, that's brilliant. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's really good to know. Thanks for sharing this with me. And so now my team gets super excited and like they come back and they're like in the Zoom chat saying, just had this amazing microaggression conversation with a donor. And it was this brilliant learning opportunity. And I got a chance to practice the things that we learned in our microaggression session. And this is how it went. And there's actually an example of a conversation that we had with a donor recently who was actually started the conversation saying, I don't really understand why Ecojustice is so passionate about Indigenous sovereignty, right? That's not going to save the environment. And through the conversation that we had, their perspective really shifted and the donor ended up doubling their donation at the end of that conversation. So there are some really good wins. We're definitely seeing more wins. It's actually very rare that a donor will walk away or that will choose to part ways because of a difference in values. But if they do, I think that's also what respectful philanthropy looks like, that we shouldn't be pushing and forcing and twisting donors' arms into supporting an organization where there maybe isn't value alignment. And our hope and our expectation is that as we move on this journey together, that our incredible donors that make Ecojustice what it is, our donors who really share our vision for this inclusive, thriving environmental space, will come along with us. And we will also engage new demographics, new types of donors, diverse communities in our fundraising community.
The experience of talking to a donor and having them look at me and be like, I hadn't thought about that. That is tax avoidance. And that does have this cascading impact on services that I'm funding right now, has also been my experience. I just wanted to hear from you because I've done it in a few different settings, but not through that lens. So that's really, really exciting to hear.
Mhm.
Is there any actionable tips that you would want to leave our audience with? So if they're looking at restructuring their fundraising, indigenizing their fundraising, what are the first few steps that you think they can tackle?
Mhm. I think we're really trying to live by the principle of nothing about us without us, right? I'd recommend that folks start with looking at who is on your team, who is on your board, who is in your organization. Have you got diverse voices within, or have you got diverse partners that you can work with to help you build your fundraising plans and help you reevaluate your fundraising communications and your fundraising strategies and how you're showing up as an organization in the charitable space? And look at if there are opportunities for you to create more inclusive recruitment, more inclusive employee policies that are going to bring in those diverse voices. Maybe it's looking at your procurement policies as well. If you're choosing vendors and choosing consultants to work with, starting there, right? So that you've got the right people working with you around the table as you move forwards on this journey. And then I think recognizing, that again, like none of us are experts in this space, right? We're all learning and unlearning together and being comfortable taking steps and taking action, knowing that you might not get it perfectly right each time, but a step forwards is still progress. And as we keep taking these steps, that is how we get better and better at what we do. I do think like our model of having these monthly sessions that are facilitated by just like other members of our team have been really powerful because it's demonstrated that departmental and organizational commitment to this work. People have got so much to offer, so many different ideas and perspectives, and that's how you really benefit from diversity, right? Like when you bring the different voices together, you've got to make the space for folks to then be able to work on the problems and problem solve together. And I'd recommend that. If folks want to reach out to me, my contact information on the blog page here. I'm happy to share our supportive philanthropy policy, fundraising and gift acceptance policy. You can reach out to me, or that's available on our website. We also have a fundraising code of conduct that sets out like the values and the principles that we adhere to in how we fundraise. So I think some first steps that I would really recommend if folks are new to this. But again, I think I've said this a few times, but we're all learning. None of us are experts. So again, if folks have heard me say things today and you're like, you know what? I think even Ecojustice could be doing that differently or doing that better. Please reach out to me and share your thoughts and your feedback because I think having these sessions, building a community of organizations working together, that's going to have so much more impact. And especially as we look at like how do we really address like some of those like deep rooted systemic inequalities that exist like within charity law and within the philanthropic sector? We're going to have to come together, and we're going to have to be fairly unified, right, in our calls for change and our calls for reform of the sector if we really do want to achieve this more equitable distribution of resources.
So I will definitely have your contact information linked in the show notes. So if you're listening to this episode later, you can connect with Huda there, and hopefully we'll get a little bit more links to all the amazing resources that she's been talking about today. But thank you again, Huda, for coming on. It's been so lovely and so exciting. And I just can't wait to see what you and your team at Ecojustice do over the next like 3, 5 years. Sounds amazing.
Thank you, Maria. Really appreciated the opportunity.
And thank you, everyone, for joining today's episode of the Small Nonprofit Podcast. As always, if you want to see our lovely faces, they are on our YouTube channel. But I hope that you took some of these tips and are going to apply them internally to your policies. There's always room for change and improvement. So, as Huda said, one step at a time, you can do it. Just if you need help, do it in community. But that's it for today. Thank you so much. And until next time, bye for now. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Small Nonprofit. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to connect with our guests directly or find me on LinkedIn. Let's keep moving money to mission and prioritizing our well-being. Bye for now.